My name is Amina McBride-Rezovic. I am the new full-time youth coordinator here at MCC, and so I'll be your moderator for the evening. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix this microphone. Okay, I think that's good. So I'm just going to do a little introduction about myself and then introduce our two great speakers, and we'll get on with the evening. So I wanted to start off this talk. I don't know if how many of you know, yesterday was the anniversary of Malcolm X's passing, his assassination. And growing up, I'm an African American, and my father fed us copious amounts of Malcolm X speeches and quotes and lectures, and he grew to be one of my top heroes. But the reality is Malcolm X is, while he's a great, amazing person, he's just a cornerstone of the African American Muslim experience. There's so much more to learn about in terms of the contributions to the American society, to the Muslim community, and to the world at large from African American Muslims. And so tonight we're going to be talking about a few of those contributors, starting with the transatlantic slave trade and some of the African Muslims who came over as enslaved peoples to the United States, and then we're gonna be moving on to talk about Sister Clara Muhammad and her movement in the African American education arena. So I want to just introduce the two speakers. This is just our program for the evening. We're a little behind schedule, as you can tell, so I apologize. Let me just. So our first speaker is Dr. Harriet Lewis. She is a PhD and Senior Director of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMAN. She has an eclectic domestic and international professional background and has worked and volunteered in services to others for over 25 years. Dr. Lewis has been the Executive Director of organizations that serve women, small business owners, survivors of domestic violence, youth, immigrants, and refugees from around the world. She's been recognized by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts House of Representatives for her services on behalf of survivors and their families. Dr. Lewis lived in Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau during her tenure as a Peace Corps volunteer, and currently serves as the Honorary Consul for the Republic of Cabo Verde. Did I say it right? Yeah? Okay. For the state of Illinois. Over the years, she has presented on topics regarding the African American diaspora, including African American religious identities. She holds a PhD from Walden University in Human Services and Social Policy Analysis and Planning, and MPA in Nonprofit Management from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lewis. I'm going to introduce both of you. So the second speaker is Sister Hind Mekki. She is an interfaith educator who holds a degree in international relations from Brown University. She's an anti-racism and youth empowerment educator. She's traveled across the United States and Western Europe, working in diverse communities in terms of leading workshops for civic leaders, interfaith engagement, activism, and university students. Hind is a former fellow of the American Muslim Civic Leadership Institute and is the founder and curator of Side Entrance, which helps to catalyze a national conversation focusing on women in the mosque. She serves on the Islamic Society of North America's Mosque Inclusion Task Force and is an advisor on the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding Project, Reimagining Muslim Spaces. And she's a consultant with American Mosques on gender, economic, and convert diversity. And locally, Hind serves on the advisory board of the Brother Geoffrey Gross FSC Institute for Dialogue, Justice, and Social Action at Lewis University, and the Chicago Muslim Project hosted at the Chicago History Museum. So, as you can tell, they're both very accomplished women with very long bios. So, thank you both for joining us. Before we get started, we're going to have a recitation from the Quran by our Hafiz Ibrahim Khan, who is a freshman at Northridge School.
Assalamu alaikum. Today I'll be reciting from the Holy Quran, Surah 49,
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. In the name of Allah, our God, the most merciful. O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. The most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you. Indeed, God is knowing and acquainted.
Okay, so first up is Dr. Harriet, and she will be speaking on the African American Muslim legacy entitled Remembrance, Resistance, and Remnants.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Okay. All right, I would like to first thank Dionaz for inviting me to present to everyone here tonight. I want to thank the Interfaith Committee and Amina for all of your work in putting this together. I am honored to be here to present to you on this topic that is not only important to me as an African American, important to me as a Muslim, but important to all of us as part of our shared humanity. You know, to learn about, to lift up this part of our history and part of our shared humanity. So I'll begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. I'm going to speak to you for a little while on the topic of remembrance, resistance, and remnants. And we're going to remember and think about and reflect upon the lives of African Muslims who were brought over here in chains to this part of the world, a foreign place. We're going to reflect upon their resistance to hold on to their deen, to hold on to their life, to hold on to their identity. And you know, we're going to look at some of the few remnants that are left. There are few remnants that are left because it was challenging to resist the transition. You know, when we think about history is always told from the perspective of the person who's in power, the community who's in power, or the bias of the researcher. And sometimes if history is not challenged, you have historians and researchers going down a particular path, unknowingly going down a path with a particular perspective. And this is kind of the case with African American Muslim research. So you have a lot of research, not enough, but a lot of research on African Americans and the maintenance of African diaspora, but then you have a little bit on African American or African Muslims. I pulled out my books and I was looking in the indices for Islam, for Muslims, because these are just a general, you know, I'm thinking I'm going to find something, or even like, you know, an archaic word like Muhammadan, and couldn't find anything. So, you know, what that tells me is that A, more research needs to be done. B, we need to go back with new lens. There needs to be more people going back with Muslim lens and rereading and going through that research again in order to identify the missed research and the missed discoveries that I'm sure exist. So, you know, I decided to start off with a few people. I'm going to run through this really fast because we have 15 minutes and I'm already 2 minutes in. So I decided to start with Mansa Abu Bakari II. He is the brother of Mansa Musa, who is today, to this date, probably the richest sultan, Mansa of the Mali Empire, worth probably 300 or 400 billion dollars in today's dollars. But his brother, who was the Mansa before him in the 14th century, gave up his rule over the Mali Empire because he wanted to explore. He traveled all over Africa. He traveled outside of Africa because he wanted to learn more, to gain more, and he decided he was going to gather, different traders and others to go out west into the Atlantic and find out what was there and see what he could discover. He sent folks out. One person came back, said everyone else, they disappeared in the water. So he said, I got to do this by myself. I got to do this, to handle my own business. So he went out. I'm imagining what this conversation could be. So he goes out with this team, with this crew, and he makes it to present-day Brazil. And he encounters the Native Americans there, and he's decided he's going to colonize this area, if you will. And this was in 1311. And he arrived there, and he began to trade with the Native Americans. In about 1314, he sent people back to his brother and established trade. This is what what has been documented over the time period. And so he began trade, and it's believed that he actually, through his trade, actually increased the wealth of Mansa Musa during that time. And it's been reported that Christopher Columbus, who arrived, of course, 200 years later, found black traders already present in the Americas, and also through chemical analysis that the gold tips of the arrows believed that the arrows were from West Africa. So there was definitely that trade from that region. And then the next person who was enslaved at the time, Mustafa, known as Esteban, was from Morocco. He was enslaved by Portuguese, sold to Spanish people who were leading a Spanish expedition, and one of the first Africans to land in what is now known as the United States. And I put them up there just to recognize that. So we can't have a presentation to talk about African Muslims who were traded during the transatlantic slave, who were enslaved on the transatlantic slave trade without pulling up this map. We know that 12.5 million people were enslaved and brought over attempted to be bring over from Western Africa, parts of Southeastern Africa, to the Americas during that time period. 2 million people died during the Middle Passage, and around 10.7 million people arrived. 5 million arrived in Brazil, 500,000 into the United States. And we also know, many of us know already in this room, that 15 to 40% of those people were Muslim. They were Muslim, which means if 15 to 40% of the people who arrived here in chains were Muslim, that means that pretty much every person, such as myself, who is a descendant of Africans who were brought over here enslaved, have a Muslim ancestor. So when you look at me, when you look at any African American, for the most part, again, you're probably looking at someone who has a great-great-grandparent, a great-great-grandparent who is Muslim. So we're gonna look at some of the ethnic groups that were already Muslim before arriving here, were already practicing Islam. So I'm gonna quickly remember some of those. Actually, I'm gonna spend a lot of time. So we know that again, Mansa Musa is from the Mali Empire, and the Mali Empire, Mandingos, or the Mandinka, are from the Mali Empire. Some Mandinka converted to Islam from their traditional beliefs as early as the 12th century. Beginning in the 16th century, tens of thousands of Mandinka were captured and shipped to the Americas, and it's believed that about 24% of the Africans who were brought to the United States were of Mandinka ancestry. Wolof, which is another group that was brought to the Americas, who are primarily in Senegal, Gambia, Mauritania, were also practicing Islam later than the Mandinkas, around the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And then we have the Fulas. The Fulas, the Fulanis, they are nomadic, and so as you see from the map on Africa, they travel across the Sahel, and actually there are remnants of their presence in Algeria as well, but that's not on this map. The majority of the Fulas on this map are in Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger. And then what you see on the next map, you see some of the empires, and some of the empires that we'll be talking about where some of the people who descended from from them that were brought to the Americas from the Futu Toro, which is in the Mali area, Futa Jalo, which is Guinea, Messina, and Sokoto Caliphate. The Hausa, I have to turn my notes, I'm just kind of rolling through here without reading. Hausa, we find Hausa who, again, were Muslim for centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, before the Europeans arrived in primarily Nigeria. This is a map of Nigeria, northern Nigeria, and then I should have put the map of Niger and the southern part of Niger as well, and Ivory Coast and Benin. And then finally, Yoruba. Yoruba, at that time, Yoruba was both practicing Islam. There were Yorubas who were practicing Islam, who were also practicing traditional beliefs. And Yorubas are primarily from Nigeria and Benin. So we're going to look at a couple of profiles, a few profiles of people who were brought over here in chains, who tried to maintain their deen, who tried to maintain their faith while here in the United States. Some of you may be familiar with some of these people already. Ayuba Suleiman Jallo, he was born in 1701. He was the son of an imam. He was a prominent Muslim. And he also, like many people during that time period, he also traded and enslaved people. And he was also a victim of the transatlantic slave trade. He and his interpreter were near the Gambia River to participate in the trading of enslaved people and were captured. The invaders shaved their heads so that they could look more like a prisoner of war, and then they sold them. They believe it may have been from the Mandingos, which could have been Muslim or could have been practicing traditional beliefs. The two men were sold to the Royal African Company, and he ended up on a tobacco farm in Maryland. He ran away. He was literate in Arabic. He spoke, he read, he wrote, and so people connected with him. He found his way into London. He eventually, I'm not telling you the whole story, he eventually ended up back on the continent in the Gambia, and his father had passed away during the time period, as did his wife moved on and married someone else. And he passed away in 1773. Next person we're going to look at is Yaro Mahmoud. He was born in 1736 in Guinea. He was enslaved and taken to Maryland in 1752. He was Fula. Because he could read and write in Arabic, it was believed that he was educated. They believed he was from a wealthy Muslim family. His enslaver told him that if he could make enough bricks to build a house, then he would be free. He did this, but by the time he did this, his enslaver had passed on. However, his enslaver's wife did provide his freedom when he did that. He became a part of the free black community of Georgetown. He purchased shares at the Columbia Bank of Georgetown. He bought a house. He lent to other merchants. He became someone prominent in the community. He lived his life. He continued to live his life as a Muslim. In his obituary, it noted that he was buried in a section of the garden where he was known to pray. Next, we have Abdurrahman Ibrahim Ibn Suri. He was born in 1762. He was captured in Guinea, in Futu Jalan, in that Futu Jalan region, and he was sold in 1788. Many of us are familiar with him as from the movie and from the book, The Prince Among Slaves. His father consolidated the Islamic Federation of the Futu Jalan in 1776. In 1781, he returned from studying, and his father, at the age of 26, made him an emir over a particular region and had him rule over 2,000 people. And while he was out in his first year as an emir, he was captured. He was captured and he was enslaved, and he was sold to the British in Natchez, Mississippi. where he labored. He married a woman by the name of Isabella. And then people, again, as many people, he became connected to other people, connected to people in U.S. government, United States Senator, the Council of Morocco, because they thought that he was a Moor, and eventually he was freed. He went for 10 months. Not the word is campaign, but he and his wife, they went around the country accepting donations, speaking, and they're trying to raise funds to purchase the freedom of their children. He was able to purchase the freedom of 2 children. Eventually, he was sent back to the continent, not to Guinea, but to Monrovia, Liberia, where he died a few months later, about 4 months later. Eventually, his 2 children joined his wife in Liberia. However, his other children remained enslaved for a while. And it's a fascinating story because today, his children in Liberia and his descendants in Liberia and his descendants in Mississippi have connected as a family after all of these years. So it's really a beautiful story, probably even before then, but it's just a beautiful story. And then Umar ibn Said, most of us are familiar with him. He was from Senegal, from the Futu Toro region. He's an Islamic scholar, born and educated in Senegal. He was enslaved and transported to the U.S. in 1807. While enslaved, for the remainder of his life, he wrote a series of books on history. He wrote 14 manuscripts in Arabic. The most famous, that most of us are familiar with, is The Life of Umar ibn Said, written in 1831. And I have 1 minute. I'm going to really fly right now, but we've gotten to the bios. Now we're going to look at the remnants. Again, it's just, people, they struggle to hold on to their identity, and we can find a few remnants. And sometimes the remnants are maintained through whoever the oppressor is. Sometimes they're just available. So we're going to just quickly go through some of the things. Chesapeake tobacco pipes. So again, the people who were enslaved, they came from all parts of West Africa. As we know, 30 to 40% came from countries that were already practicing Islam, from Mali, from northern Nigeria. And so we have these Chesapeake tobacco pipes that are believed to be, that the designs that are on the clay from the pipes mirror, from an archaeologist's perspective, from his research, mirrors the same designs that are on pottery that's found in Mali. Similar situation with a lot of the quilts that were produced from the African Americans during slavery. Again, you can see different types of designs that mirror different traditions across the continent. And then also in music. Do we want to hear music? Yes. Or not? Yes. Okay, so really quickly, just 2 things. Can I? All right, 2 things. So, we know that call and response is very, call and response comes from African tradition in many places. But, there's this similar to Senegalese zikr as well. And there was also some similar to different African American music to the Adhan, but I didn't put that here, and I don't know if I can do this. How do I do that?
You should just be able to click on it.
Did y'all? It's not doing anything. Oh. What do you do? Oh.
Let's just do this.
No, that's not right. I'm gonna do it worse. All right.
It should just open.
It did just open. Let me just do this. Okay. So we have we should listen to music. All right. So this is a clip. I'm going to show you 2 clips from this particular group. And this is not what I want to show you though. This is what I want to show you next. So, this is a song that resembles call and response. That's very similar to the vicar in the next video. But y'all can't hear that. So I'm going to go ahead, while she's putting the mic over there, I'm going to go ahead and just grab remember what that sounded like. I'm going to just quickly go to the vicar, which is, if you remember the call and response. All right, I'm going to end there. In addition to the call and response, we have one more. The ring shout, which is something that's done in many African American churches, is now seen as being connected to Islam, in that it reflects. Scholars have suggested that the ritual may have originated with enslaved Muslims who were circling the Kaaba, as in Tawa, and that shout is not shout, it's actually shout, and I can't, and I'm now too far into my time. All right, so here are the women who are actually doing the praying. Okay, now. So you see they're moving around in a circle. And if you imagine an enslaved African Muslim who only wants to practice their religion, only wants to practice their faith tradition, only wants to make Hajj, they make Hajj where they can. So this is one of the theories. All right. I'm going back really fast. Where are we at? Where's the presentation? All right, finally. So when I was talking about those books that I pulled off of my bookshelf, I came across this one, and I just opened it up, and it didn't say anything about Islam. But when I started reading it, if you look at it, right there where it says, you know, religion is not anything that it used to be, folks had to starve themselves. Folks were fasting back in the old times. This is somebody's great-great-grandfather they were talking about their great-great-grandparent in the olden days. They would starve themselves, they would pray and they would seek, sometimes a month or more. They're talking about Ramadan right there. They're talking about fasting, they're talking about deep prayer, they're talking about Ramadan. And nowhere in this book that it didn't say Islam, it did not say this person was practicing Ramadan. It just said that was how we used to do religion back then. So, 20th and 21st centuries, I'm going to move through this. When the transport of Africans to the United States ended, so did the practice of Islam as passed down for centuries. Cultural and religious movements fostered in a new relationship with Islam that continues until today. Islam continues to grow among the African American population in at least 13 African American communities, Muslim communities. One of the largest is the community of Clara Muhammad, with over 300 mosques and centers in the United States and the Caribbean. Some notable contemporary African American Muslims, scholars, we know many of them, in entertainment, athletes, and civic leaders. Here's a short resource list. And some questions that I would like everyone to think about while we're at our small groups at the tables. I want you to think about some things. How we're all connected, how we're all part of this shared humanity. I want you to think about this in first person. How are my family struggle and migration experience, forced and volunteer, similar or different to those experiences and struggles of the African American Muslims in the 18th and 19th centuries? Were members of my family enslaved or enslavers? Also, before tonight, did I ever think about African American Muslims as part of the broader African American or Muslim communities? If so, how? If not, why not? 3, did I gain any new information this evening? And 4, what do I want to further explore about the African American Muslims? Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, so next up is Sister Hind Mekki, and she will be presenting on Dr. Clara Muhammad's schools. Just a kind of caveat, this session could be 4 or 5 sessions really to cover everything. So this is just a small droplet in what is available to us in terms of information. So I hope that everybody takes something from this and in the coming weeks, days, months, tries to do their own research and learn a little bit more about it.
And thank you again to MEC and to the Interfaith Committee for inviting us to speak, in Black History Month about the histories of African American Muslims and the impacts that they've had today in our communities. And so it's really funny what you said about this could be a course, because in fact, when I was in college, I actually took a whole course on Islam in West Africa, and we spent weeks on a person I'm just going to very briefly mention. So this will show you how deep and important this is. And I'm actually really happy that I came after Dr. Harriet spoke, because I couldn't do all of what you've done. But I think there's the link. There's definitely the link. And I want to just say 2 things. Well, actually, I'll hold one off, but I want to start, I think it's very important to start with Islam in Africa. So when we were talking about the enslaved Muslims who were brought over here, what was happening in Africa at that time? One of the people that you mentioned in your last slide was Dr. Bilal Ware, who has a book called The Walking Qur'ans, and he writes extensively about the educational system, the religious educational system in West Africa that remained. That actually remains to this day. And one of the sort of examples of that is what was happening in the Sokoto Caliphate in present-day Nigeria, where Princess Nana Asma'u, the daughter of Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, lived. And she lived her life between and around the times of the French Revolution, the U.S. Civil War, so she died right before the end of the U.S. Civil War, and also when the Ottoman Empire was losing a lot of territories in Africa and in the Middle East. This is when she was living, and this is actually when the Sokoto Caliphate was on the rise. It was a very strong and shining example of Muslim communities in the world. Now, her father, Osman Dan Fodio, was the founder of the Caliphate. He's the one that I could spend weeks and weeks studying and talking to you about. But his greatest complaint, and so we're talking about, he died in 1817, so this is the time that we're talking about. His greatest complaint was the lack of education and access to education for specifically women. There's a fantastic quote that he has, which I will share with you all privately later. We don't have enough time to say now. Now, he didn't just talk the talk, he also walked the walk. His daughter was considered highly educated. Now, a highly educated person in his caliphate was somebody who has a background in different Muslim languages, not just Arabic, somebody who has a background in Islamic law, in exegesis of the Quran, in hadith transmission, and she was considered one of the most well-educated people in the entire caliphate. She was a diplomat for him and an advisor for him, her older brother who became the caliph after her father passed away, and his son as well. So 3 caliphs saw her as one of their main advisors. Now, what did she do? She created this really amazing curriculum, education curriculum, the Yantaru curriculum, where what she did was she identified a real challenge of rural women in their caliphate who didn't have access to writing and reading. And so what she would do, her Yantaro curriculum was to take one woman who was over the age of 40, typically, past childbearing years, and one girl who was under the age of childbearing, around 14 years, and she would train them in pairs together for years. And she would train them in a poetic kind of way so that they would be able to memorize different, Islamic principles, for example. And then they would go off to the rural areas, the two of them. And the older woman would teach the older women, the younger girl would teach the younger girls, and there would be a continuity. And these traditions remain to this day. And in fact, there was a former British Foreign Service officer named Jean Boyd who in 1981 went to Nigeria, and she says that she went there to educate the people and to help them find God, and she found people who were educated and who already had God. And she met with the descendant of one of these teachers, teachers from the Yantaro curriculum in 1981, who told her, in fact, the curriculum was still continuing and people were still learning the faith. So this was happening and starting in West Africa about 50 years before Clara Muhammad was born. Now, Sister Clara Muhammad, this is the other piece I wanted to mention to you today, is that when we talk about Muslims in the United States, we must talk about the Nation of Islam. And during our Q&A, I'll be happy to share with you and respond to some of your questions around this. But I want you to understand, to think about the early 20th century in the United States, what life was like for African Americans, right? And so this is a context in which Clara Muhammad, who was born Clara Evans in 1899, which she was born and raised into. Now, once she was asked about, how did you enter Islam? How did you hear about this teacher who started the Nation of Islam? One of her friends told her, there's a man who's saying that we, our people, Africans, were royalty. We used to dress in long flowing cloths, and we were a people, right? And so that's what connected her to want to learn more and to improve her life. Now, why is that? As I mentioned, she was born in 1899 in Macon, Georgia, rural Georgia, and she was, lived in a time of Jim Crow, right? And she and her husband both, they decided to move up north in the Great Migration to Detroit. And they lived a very difficult life because this was around also the Great Depression. Now, Elijah Muhammad was somebody who was, before he joined the Nation of Islam, had a lot of difficulties in his life around poverty, substance abuse. And his wife, Clara Muhammad, she was only formally educated till about 7th or 8th grade, right? So now we're talking about a woman who just had a junior high education. And this was actually a huge feat for anyone, any black person in the rural South. And you can imagine when they move up north and her husband engages or he encounters the teachings of Marcus Garvey and as well as Noble Drew Ali, these sort of proto-Islamic movements that were in the early 20th century. She, in fact, was the one who discovered Master Fard Muhammad. She is the one who heard about the Nation of Islam, and she thought the message of the Nation of Islam would be something that would really help her husband, kind of get through the difficulties of his life and try to pull up their family. Now, why was that? Why was that? This quote that I found is really, really amazing. It's actually the quote here is that homeschooling was illegal in the early 1920s in the United States, and the Muhammads decided that they were not going to have their children go to school in the public schools. They didn't want them in the public schools because typically if there was any mention of African Americans or Africans, it was either negative or it was condescending. And so they decided that they wanted to train their children in an anti-Eurocentric curriculum, right? It's kind of a handful, but that's what they wanted to do. But that was illegal. So her husband would get arrested, and the police would come to her house, and she reportedly once told a policeman, "I would rather be as dead as this doorknob, than send my kids to public school." And so this is the kind of ferocity that she had in terms of wanting her children to be educated. Why was that? Interestingly, as I mentioned, most of the schools in the U.S. did not have very positive outlook for African Americans in general. And there was a scholar in that time, Lincoln, who mentioned that the Muslim schools, and here he's talking about the Nation of Islam schools, are emphasizing Negro history, Negro achievements, and the contributions of Negroes to the world's great cultures and to the development of the American nation. These facts are rarely taught in public schools, and the Muslims may be alone in trying to bring the Negro community to an awareness of racial heritage. And an Arab scholar, a little later in the 1950s, he was doing research on the schools, on the Sister Clara Muhammad schools, which were not called that at that time, and he said that the main task of the school is to aid students in developing a more satisfying culture and in forming a new identity which refutes the traditional white stereotypes of the Negro. How did they do that? As you can see the mission on my slide, but specifically this vision of know self, love self, and do for self was really, really critical. In the 1960s, with the work of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam grew, the population grew, and so the schools grew. And nearly every city that had a temple had a school. And these schools were typically primary schools, like K through 6th grade, and sometimes there was also high school. By 1975, which is a really important year, there were 41 schools in the US and in Bermuda as well. What Sister Clara Muhammad also did, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, was really create a kind of really feminine education system, which was in some ways different to what Nana Asma'u did, and in some ways similar to it. And these, the MGT, which is the Muslim Girls Training, which wasn't just girls, it's women as well, really helped to train young women in not just kind of domestic skills, but also in self-defense, also in language, also in religion and nutrition and business skills. And there was also an emphasis on women's roles in supporting their husbands. These schools still exist today, and I also have a little video to show you because I want to show you what the schools look like today. So this video is just from a couple of years ago, and you can hear and see the passion in the voices of the people in this video. And I want to talk about, stop that. And I want to talk about why that is. Now, in 1975, Elijah Muhammad passed away, and his son, Imam Warthaddin Muhammad, took over leadership of the Nation of Islam. And I'm, again, just zipping through a lot of really deep and important history. But one of the most important things that Imam Warthaddin Muhammad did was there was a big shift in the ideology of most of the adherents of the Nation of Islam. The shift turned from, the very from essentially black nationalism into what many people would term small o orthodox Sunni religious ideology. And there was that shift that occurred as well in the schools and in the curriculum of the schools. And what was happening really between 1975 until the early 1990s was a real a real look, like a second look into the schools. What are they teaching? And what happened was they changed essentially the religious education of the schools. They brought in a lot of Arabic teachers from the Middle East or Africa, and that's actually where my story intersects as well. My family is from East Africa. We speak Arabic, and my mom, my father, and some of our friends were teachers at one of the local Sister Clara Muhammad schools at the university, the Muslim, what is it called now, the University of Islam out on 75th Street, right? And so there was a shift in the curriculum. Again, these are certified, schools. In every state, they go through the certification of the school. And the schools today still have a focus on African achievements and Islam in Africa, right? As well as African American Muslim history and tradition. But there was some restructuring, as I mentioned, and then there was really critically a connection with other Islamic schools in the United States. So this last point here, CISNA, the Council of Islamic Schools of North America, in the early 1990s, the Sister Clara Muhammad schools, really the people who were leading the schools not only joined CISNA, but actually became part of the leadership of CISNA, right? So you had people who were former principals of Sister Clara Muhammad schools who were leading the CISNA programs in terms of training teachers, in terms of looking at how curriculum for K through 6 is developed. And here this is really critical because a lot of immigrant origin Muslim spaces often erase the story of African American Muslims, right? We hear that and we see that everywhere. I don't need to spend too much time on that. One of the last things I want to mention is that there actually are a lot of really notable alums or graduates of Sister Clara Muhammad schools. Two of them were very, very kind in spending time with me and sharing not only their academic research, but also their personal experiences. Dr. Jamila Kareem from Atlanta, and historian Precious Rashida Muhammad, who was born here in Chicago. And they, as well as Dr. Fatima Fanusi, plenty of people, almost every single, African American Muslim who was raised in the Imam Warthaddin Muhammad's community, who probably had some kind of engagement, some touch with the Sister Clara Muhammad schools. Not only that, one of my good friends, and I'll end here, and I see a lot of tension, maybe a little bit, but I want to mention this because I'm really cognizant of the fact that we're in an Islamic school here. We're in the largest Islamic school in the Chicagoland area. I'm a graduate of an Islamic school. I attended Aqsa School in Bridgeview, where I'm from, where I was raised. And these are sort of more kind of ethnicity-based schools in a lot of ways. Let's just say that frankly. One of my very good friends is Assyrian American, and they used to live here. Then her dad got a job in Savannah, Georgia. And her father and her mother decided that they were going to send her and her little brother to the Sister Clara Muhammad schools there. And they were and this was in the 90s, mid-90s, and they might have been the only Arabs there. So I asked her, what was that experience like for you? And she said literally, I don't think it dawned upon me that I was Arab American, right? We went to school, we went to the Islamic school at the Sister Clara Muhammad school. African Americans were the majority, so the lenses for me as a child, it was normal. And my parents told us that they chose to go to these school, to that masjid and to the school because they liked the khutbahs, they liked the sermons, the religious sermons. It was relevant. So I grew up looking up to Imam Siraj Wahaj and Malcolm X, and it wasn't until I moved to the Middle East, which she did after college, and we moved back to Chicago, which said something, that I saw that the racism toward African American Muslims and how they've been removed from the American Muslim narrative. The people claiming to be the first to do things are often not the first. The Muslim people who claim that they're the first to do X, Y, or Z are often not the first. It's often African Americans who are the first, just the stories are not told. And she told me a lot of things, but one of the things that stuck with me was that after 9/11, well, first of all, the school that she attended was across the street from an abortion clinic, and this is in Savannah, Georgia. So you can imagine the protests that happened in front of the abortion clinic. And I asked her, did you ever feel afraid, people with their guns and stuff? And she said, nope, we never got attacked. After 9/11, the Pakistani mosque got burned down, and nobody dared, was the word that she used, dared to attack our mosque and our school. And I want to end with her words, not because I want to take away from African American or African Muslim experiences, but I wanted to end with her words because I think it's really critical for all of us in this room who are not African American, whether we're directly from Africa, or from the Middle East, South Asia, who are white Americans, or whatever your background is, to understand that we cannot understand Islam in America without understanding the African American experience. Both the enslaved Africans, who were the first people to put their heads down on the ground and pray here as Muslims, through the Nation of Islam and all the proto-Islamic groups of the early 20th century, we literally would not be here today, I believe, sitting in this beautiful mosque if it wasn't for their experiences and their trailblazing. And they haven't gone away. They're still here, and I think it's really important for us. And the questions that Dr. Harriet mentioned for you were really questions that I was thinking about as I put this presentation together. How Sister Clara Muhammad, how did she affect me personally, and how does she affect all of us, even if we don't actually know her name? I guarantee you know somebody who, if you know a Muslim, you know somebody who has been touched by her school. So thank you, I appreciate you giving me
So just a quick announcement, if you do need to go pray, they are starting prayer momentarily. I think they made the adhan already. So just an announcement for that. We're going to move on to question and answer. So if I could have the two speakers come up onto the stage, we're going to start that. Yeah.
The first question again.
Harriet.
Dr. Harriet, is that I live this in the law, and right now I currently live in Monrovia. So the piece that you talked about with the family finding the family back in America, I'm gonna look into that when I return back to Monrovia. But also, 2009. So it's been a blessing for me, but as far as being a Black American and being raised, I'm born and raised in a 99.9% Christian family, and I tend to find myself as the lone wolf when it comes to speaking about Islam from a solid foundation where I can feel comfortable enough where I can convince my family that as Black Americans, African Americans, that we have a deep-rooted history in America, as far as the Constitution. The Constitution was written, beside with the Quran sitting right beside. So that's why I asked for you is that. So as I learn and grow, what kind of resources could I use to help me grow my Islam and help me become a bigger member of the Ummah here in Chicago, And so if you can help me guide me to some resources.
Thank you for that question. I transitioned to Islam. I was raised in a Christian family. As a matter of fact, I'm from Kansas City. The church where I grew up at, right next door, was a Nation of Islam huge mosque that later became a Clara Muhammad school. Yeah, so that's where I was raised. You know, our families as African Americans, most of us who are not second, third, fourth generation Muslims, because those families still exist, our broader family are Christian. And it's about just identifying these similarities and educating our families about the similarities in Islam and Christianity, because there are a lot. A friend of mine who just recently moved to a different state, he tells this story, and I love this story that he tells about when he first told his grandmother that he became Muslim. It was time for him to pray. And he commenced to he was raised by his grandmother, and he commenced to praying in front of his grandmother, kneeling down and putting his forehead to the floor. And she watched him intensely, and then she beautifully said to him, I read somewhere in the Bible where Jesus put his head to the floor when he knelt. And that was a connection for them. And, you know, I'm finding that you'd be surprised how, you know, this history of Islam in America goes back, you know, a century. As far as this revival of Islam, or this, you know, this black nationalism that existed. And you'd be surprised how many family members that you may have already that have a connection to Islam that you just may not know of already. But additional resource, so you have that. So I'm just thinking about different ways that you can connect. And then there are, of course, there are resources, the Quran itself. As far as books, one book that I found very powerful that you could share with family members that, again, could connect them is Dr. Sherman Jackson's book. I had in the resource list, Islam and the Black American. That book, what I like about that book, it talks about Islam and African American religion as black religion, and as one thing, as this continuum, and it's not separate. And that's if you have, I would share that with family members because it doesn't feel so foreign to them.
I'd also just add, there's a website, so sapelosquare.org, and it's amazing. It's a national website. They often will have, you know, historical, you know, articles, analysis. They talk about the origins of, I guess, the revival of Islam, as well as the contiguous Muslim communities that existed in the South. To this day, on Sapelo Square, so Sapelo, SAPELO.org, sapelosquare.org, and it's just a phenomenal resource.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nabil. So one of the points that you brought up, and I think like a lot of us are well aware of, the erasure of black Muslims in the narrative of the Muslim narrative in America. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, you know, prior to, I'd say, like the 70s, 80s, and again, I know I'm being like very quick impression off a lot of history, the idea of what a Muslim meant in the American consciousness, you know, wasn't an olive-skinned man with a beard. It was a black Muslim man in a suit. And it's only like during those like years after that that shifted. And again, in that case of race, how can both black Muslims and non-black Muslims help shift that image such that we either bring it back to prominence or shift away from, again, this idea of having to be, you know, this idea of like an olive-skinned man with a beard.
Yeah, that's a really incredible point. And from Lincoln, and he was talking about the schools. He kept saying the Muslim schools, because, you know, it was in the his quote was in the 1940s, and for them in the 1940s, Muslim was, as you mentioned, black men, you know, clean-shaven black men in suits. And I think that the idea that Muslim, that came really after the Iran Revolution in 1979, right? Because before 79, Muslim meant Muhammad Ali, right? Muslim is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Any American, they'll say, yeah, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they're Muslim. Malcolm X, they're Muslim. And they're black, and their nationality or their religion. The question about nationality, or if you would say citizenship, only came as really ironically, after the Civil Rights Act, after 1965, the immigration laws changed and allowed for vast non-white. And so that's one point. The other point I want to mention is that still prominent Muslims in popular culture, whether it's Mahershala Ali, who hopefully will win another Academy Award this weekend, whether it's somebody like Tara Maratak,
Brock Ali.
Brock Ali, yes, Mara Brock Ali, who has several TV shows, produces several TV shows on BET. These are in the black community, whether you're Muslim or not. African American Muslims are still very prominent, and we still see them. Ittihaj Ali is one of the most well-known Muslim athletes. You had, before the 2080s, the two Muslims in Congress were both African American, and maybe that's why we didn't hear a lot of controversy about them, because there's no question really about it, unless certain racists, of course. But there has been, I think that shift has come because Muslim has now meant immigrant. And I think there's two ways for us to really kind of try to change that. For immigrant origin Muslims, including African, think about what story are we stepping into? Islam didn't start when the first immigrant Muslims came here after 1966. Islam wasn't taught for the first time, in 1980 when, the Muslim Student Association started Arabic, right? And for us to really shift that framework as well. And to not just speak for other people, but to also pass the mic. And when I was invited to speak on today, I was kind of thinking, okay, I'm black, but I'm not African American, but I'll accept it because this is a really important topic and it's dear to my heart, the Sister Clara Muhammad legacy. But I think it's important for us to really take ownership of the larger society. We shouldn't accept from the larger society to tell us who is an American Muslim and who is not. Anyone else?
I know people have questions that are like nagging lines.
So the Sister Clara Muhammad School, say they are now with the Muslim community. My kids go to MCC, I'm part of this community. I haven't really heard much about Sister Clara Muhammad School since I've been here. Haven't seen them at the panels or the talks that I've gone to with the MCC speakers or whatever. So is there engagement between those communities? I would love to see more engagement with those communities. How do we bring that about?
That's a really good point. In the 90s, there was a lot of engagement with the Islamic schools when they were developing curriculum in English for the first time for certified Islamic schools in the United States, parochial schools. There was a lot of engagement at that time. In some cities, and also in Brooklyn, New York, there is a lot of engagement because the presence of the Sister Clara Muhammad schools is not just overwhelming, but has been there as an institution for decades, right? For generations, really. And so that's the case in some cities. But in a city like Chicago that I think has at least 14 full-time certified Islamic schools, in that group of the 14 that I know that they meet, in terms of the principles and the curriculum development, you don't really see folks coming in from the Muhammad University of Islam, right, coming in to do that. I know that the people school down in the city are interested. I have spoken with them. I've spoken with one of the administrators who said, I'd love to have my students, my high school girls, go to the high school that I attended and do exchanges, just meet with each other, participate in that way. But I also want to say that we can't expect, we immigrant origin Muslims can't expect African American Muslims to always step up and say, hey, include us, right? Because in many times, they're already not only doing the work, but they've gone past some of the questions that we're still grappling with, right? And so I think it's actually, in cities that have councils of Muslim schools, it's actually up to those councils to reach out to those schools that exist and say, hey, like we want to build a relationship, and what would it take for us to do that? Not again saunter in and say, hey, we want to build a relationship, let's do something together. It's really building a partnership and building relationship from the beginning. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So this is actually for you, Dr. Lewis. So I was actually in the community cafe in Atlanta a couple of weeks back. And fantastic event. Like, I love the work that the Inner City Muslim Action Network does, and the fact that they expanded the lunch trade too. But again, like one of the things that I noticed there, like we were at Booker T. Washington High School, and again, like I think as expected, like the majority of the population was like Black Muslims or like non-Black Muslims. But how do you, for instance, like especially like in these spaces where I think a lot of like blackness is policed, you know, as like Islamic and Islamic. Like how can you reconcile? Like how can you get, you know, I guess like people to be able to expand and practice, or how would you, I guess, like suggest non-Muslim, non-Black Muslims such as myself to be able to, I guess, like integrate in space in a respectful manner without like trying to like control the narrative again or whatever.
Thank you. I'm glad that you were able to experience the community cafe in Atlanta. I have a question though. So when you're at, did you experience that type of that non-African American Muslims were in a space that were trying to change the narrative?
I don't know specifically in that specific setting, but you know, because of that I don't particularly feel like in that setting. I feel, you know, that at times, for instance, like whenever I was an undergrad, you know, a third of the, you know, Muslims on campus, you know, identify as Black, but they didn't feel comfortable at MSAs, you know, that were pretty much like South Asian and Arab middle class interests like drum. And you know, anytime I've like been in a space that has it, I feel like that ends up happening. Like this, yeah, like of not really giving, honoring the Black experience as part of the Muslim experience.
I think like many things that we have to talk about and be real about. We have to be real about privilege. We have to be real about our experience and how we're perceived in the broader community. And as Sister Hen mentioned, we have to, now I'm shifting a little bit, we have to welcome people in. We have to acknowledge the privilege, and then we have to pass the mic. We have to not always be in the forefront. And I think once we do that, I think we can get beyond that. And so sometimes when you see this division or you see these separate circles and people not feeling comfortable, it's because people feel a certain kind of way, like they're walking into a space where people feel privileged. And some people are not willing to deal with that. And I think in order to get beyond that is to communicate, is to be intentional about going out of your comfort zone or out of what's expected. It's like what we're doing here in this space right here with the interfaith community here in this space. People who are going out of their way to connect with people, with our broader community, because it's important. That's what we should be doing. I mean, I think that those small steps, that's what we try to do with the community cafes. We try to create spaces where people of different backgrounds, different faith traditions, different ethnicities can come together and experience love. And I think that if we lead with love, those kinds of barriers will be reduced. And I think we have to just be intentional about it. I think sometimes it's easier to be, you know, to just not think about it, you know, to continue on with my day, to not stress over these things or figure that someone else will take care of it. But someone else will take care of these things. But, you know, if we really want to make change, we have to be intentional. We have to feel uncomfortable. We have to make ourselves feel uncomfortable. I enjoy feeling uncomfortable. I create situations where I can feel uncomfortable. I'm the only one. So that I like to feel uncomfortable so that I can learn. I know that I'm growing then. So I think that's part of it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Oh, I have 2 questions, but I'll make them note. So thank you both so much for speaking. So my first question is kind of like a history buff question about the Clara Muhammad schools. You mentioned that it was considered truancy for Black children to go to these schools, to be homeschooled, or not to go to public school. So just, do you have any information about kind of like if the Sister Clara Muhammad schools like led in kind of were the trailblazers in terms of like legally kind of how that came to be in terms of homeschooling? And then my other question just has to do with, I forgot who of the two of you is involved with the Chicago History Museum, but just for both of you, thinking about, we're so close to Chicago, what are things maybe that we should know about Chicago history specifically to do with Black Muslims?
So I tried to look into that in terms of what was the role of Sister Clara Muhammad schools around, I was surprised myself to hear that Elijah Muhammad was arrested and thrown in jail because his kids were not in the public schools. And I couldn't find a lot of information about that. What I did find was that it's the homeschooling that was illegal at that time, so not the private schools. They're already at that time, in the early 20th century, there were Catholic schools, right? This was also, by the way, the time where parochial schools were beginning in the white communities. And so I think that's why the Sister Clara Muhammad schools, they then got connected to the branches of the temples. And actually this was envisioned from the beginning. There was this idea that any branch in any city, that there would be a school connected to it, kind of like a lot of the Catholic parishes, right? And so I think that I don't know what the relationship is between homeschooling as we see it today, which is legal, of course, now, and the Sister Clara Muhammad schools. I tried to see whether there was a link, but in the early years, the Sister Clara Muhammad schools were not really that interested in changing the broader American society. They were more interested in improving the lives of African Americans and African American Muslims. And so I don't know that that was a priority for them to change the laws in that sense. The second question around the Chicago History Museum, I'm super happy to talk to anyone after the Q&A session as well, around the oral history project that the Chicago History Museum is doing on Muslims in the Chicago area, the city and the suburbs. And it's around space, around migration, and around identities. And we have, I would say, a pretty broad, of course it could always be broader, group of advisors from different ethnic and sectarian backgrounds and racial backgrounds. And we have somebody from an African American Ahmadiyya community, for example. I think that's that history is something that's not known. So Dr. Fatima Fanusi, who I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, she is a graduate or an alum of the Sister Clara Muhammad schools. A lot of her research is in the early history of the Nation of Islam. Who was Master Fard Muhammad? What was the role of the Ahmadiyya community in dawah, right? In having missionary to the African Americans in the United States in the early 20th century. And the role of the Ahmadiyya community, I think, in shaping early 20th century American Islam is under-researched, it's under-studied, it's not known. The community still exists today as a contiguous African American Ahmadiyya community, still exists here in Chicago, or in the Chicagoland area. And I know that for a lot of Muslims from Sunni and Shia backgrounds, there's a lot of ideological challenges with saying, oh, these people are Muslim or not Muslim. But I'm not here to make any kind of fatwa on that. I'm just here saying that is a huge part of the story, because the Ahmadiyya community, when they migrated from South Asia to the US, they initially were part of this sort of movement. I don't want to call it New Agey, but there was a sort of New Age movement in upper class white communities at the time, who were the spiritualist movements, who were leaving Christianity, leaving Judaism, and finding the religions of the East, if you will. And the Ahmadiyya community, when they first came here, the first missionaries, they were trying to do missionary to these upper class white Americans, but when they came here and they came to cities like Detroit, they thought, wait a minute, the people who really need the message of Islam and the people who are actually flocking to us are African Americans. And so they actually shifted their priorities. Now, I am not a scholar on this. Dr. Fatima Fanusi has a fantastic body of work on this, and you can actually find a lecture that she has done on YouTube as well on the history of that. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that that's just one of the communities that will be part of the oral history project. That's something that is, as I mentioned, unknown relatively. So.
Okay, so that's all the time that we have for question and answer. We're going to be moving now to small group discussions. I'm just pulling up the question now. So the question that we would like you to discuss with your group at your table is the following. What is your role in continuing this narrative sharing? And how have you been impacted by this conversation? And so we're going to give about 15 to 20 minutes for you guys to talk amongst yourselves, and then we're going to come back as a larger group to kind of discuss what you guys came up with.
I was at a presentation the other day where somebody said, well, I'm doesn't sound right. I don't think that's true. But
So one interesting observation we made in our table was, Catherine was mentioning how in the Christian community, well, I had first commented that rather than thinking of the immigrant Muslim community competing or taking over or eclipsing the African American community, we might want to think of them as perhaps two separate communities that are growing and evolving from different streams of historical perspectives. And the comment was made that also in the Christian community here in the U.S. that you have black Christian communities and white Christian communities that also kind of evolve parallel to each other and don't necessarily interact as much. But yeah, that was just an interesting observation. Another comment that I had with the immigrant community was in the 70s and 80s, one thing that shifted was because of this immigration policies, but also the Cold War, there were immigrants with backgrounds in sciences were preferred. And so that was the first time, perhaps in the history of American Islam, that you have a significant group of American Muslims who immigrate to the U.S. in a position of power and strength where they have the professional skills and resources to be able to build institutions quickly, buildings and organizations and these types of things. So those are just different trends to think about also when we're looking at American Islam.
Anyone else? Come on, I know there was a lot of great discussion.
I guess one thing our table really talked about was making the effort to get uncomfortable in visiting the communities, the African American mosques, the African Americans, making them come to us and share that we owe it to lift up that community that's been here before us, give them the respect that they deserve, and just get out of our comfort zones and learn from them. So be that, visit those mosques, take our children to those mosques, let it be a normal thing that this is Muslim too, this is American too, just like us, and create that bond with our families and schools.
One last comment. Anyone?
I can make that. I mean, I wasn't thinking about this. I wasn't thinking about this of sharing this. It just came to me. Even before talking about as American Muslims or anything, do we even talk about marital relationships, like intercultural marriages? The wife of Ibrahim al-Islam, right? With the line that Rasulullah come from, Hajar Rasulullah. Like, she was a black woman. How often do we talk about that? How often are we consciously making an effort to find sisters and brothers from the black community get married into your own families, like brown people, Arabs, whatnot, right? That was something that came to my mind. We're talking about communities, walking into somebody else's space, neighborhoods, mosques. What about kitchens together, or bedrooms together? That's what the first community is, right? Your family is your first community, as the Ummah of Rasulullah. So it's just sort of that just dawned on me. So I had to share it.
Okay, so before we have our closing reflection, I just want to mention that there are bean pies available for sale. They're $10 a pie. I highly recommend buying one because they're really, really good. So we're going to have Mr. Van Gilmer from the Baha'i Faith do our closing remarks.
I don't know now why I said yes. But I think we're all stepping up as we learn pieces of history that's been lost for so long that it's shocking to even think. For instance, I'm an African American, born here, lived in a black community during segregation, where I knew nothing at all about Muslims, not anything. So my learning came later. Later in the beginning of the civil rights movement, when we also knew about Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. We didn't know very much about them, and yes, they were activists. But those of us who were African American some of us were activists too, because we were asking for freedom. We were asking to be able to go places we had not been before. So I think, I thought when I came, I said, I need to go to this, because I need to hear what can be said about Muslims being here as African Americans, which is not something I ever thought. So it's a period of growth, I think, for all of us to start thinking about what these roots really are. The real story is we all came from Africa. That's what the real story is. And if we trace how man migrated all over the world and had all these different colors and looked so many different ways, that now trying to discover the connection is hard. So when I came here maybe 3 years ago and someone said, I'm black, and it was a Muslim woman, and in my mind I was saying, you're not black. Your color is, but you're not. It wasn't the black I was thinking about. So nights like this provide us with an opportunity to begin to grow, because it's not our distinctions that bring us together. It's our similarities. And so we're talking about some of those similarities. And it'll take a long time, I think, for us to be one human family. But it's something we know that we want inside. But we've got to migrate from wherever we are. And we've got to learn history that has been lost. And then figure out how we're going to become one. So I think when we leave here, we need to think about, okay, let me go back and look at my history again. Let me see if I actually did maybe have a relative that did speak Arabic and I didn't know it. I don't know how many of us who are African American have started trying to look at our own background to see who really are we. And I did DNA, I did a number of things, and I traced it back, and I said at this table, to a white man. A white man who owned what became my great-great-grandmother. He owned her. And then they had a child. And that child never became a part of this white family. So I never knew I never knew. It's hard for me to even find him or her, whoever they are, but usually it's a he. And so we're growing, and I think with the growth, we're beginning to see how we're beginning to come back together. We came from Africa. We're not all going back to Africa, but we're growing. We're growing from thinking about what this migration did. So I appreciate that this happened tonight. And I'm glad I came because I heard things I didn't know, and I got to go back now and try to trace them. So let's all go back and let's try to grow.
Amen.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. I hope that you guys took away something that you can go back with and do more research on. I just want to give a plug for our the next interfaith event. It will be, there's an interfaith iftar, which is going to happen May 9th, which is a Thursday. It's going to be from 6:30 to 9. RSVPs they're asking for you to RSVP by April 15th, just so we know how much food to get. And the topic of the night will be Muslim contributions through philanthropy. So if you want to know more about that, you can talk to me later or Sister Dilnaz. So thank you again so much for coming. I hope to see you guys at that event in May, and have a good night.
Thank you.